Two more? Glasses.
Yeah, I think we're going to get a couple more water glasses, but I'm quite happy just to get started because I know there is a lot on with the COP just now.
There's a bigger problem, somebody's taking the tea bags out of the room.
Oh no!
So I'm not sure the meeting is going to.
I'm Secretary of the Scottish TUC, and at this top table today we have with us Mcllvogue from the RMT Trade Union, we have Mcllvogue from the Unite Trade Union, we have a man beside me that probably needs no introduction, Jeremy Corbyn, we have Kevin Lindsay from the ASLEF Trade Union, and we have Gary Kelly from the TSSA Trade Union, and all of these trade unions have been working together really hard on building a vision for the future of Scotland's railways, and that's what we're here to talk about today, which obviously links in a lot to the wider COP and the discussions around getting to net zero and delivering a just transition to net zero. But before I go on and introduce our comrades from the rail unions, I'm going to just ask Jeremy to say a few words to set the scene for today. Thanks.
Thank you, Ros, and thank you all for coming. Good morning to everyone here, and great to see Mcllvogue here as General Secretary of ASLEF. Full support in your current dispute with, your ongoing dispute with Transport for London and the tube drivers there. Their winning their dispute is very important for the whole rail industry, and I'm sure everyone's very well aware. You're most welcome. Lovely to see you, Mcllvogue. This document, given most of it in a hurry last night, the Vision for Scotland's Railways, I think everything I've seen is absolutely excellent because of the principles behind it. We have to maintain jobs and livelihoods at the same time as transforming our economy into a green, sustainable economy. That is a massive undertaking. It requires education, it requires action, and it requires the input of trade unions and working class communities. You could transition to a green economy by laying off loads of people, making that high levels of unemployment, just like the way Thatcher destroyed the mining industry. Or you can do it differently. You can invest and have public interest and public control of the transport system and other systems as well. And what this document does is set out a future for transport across Scotland and pointing out that rail usage is the most environmentally way of transporting goods, the most environmentally and fastest way of transporting people, but it does require investment, it does have to be properly run. And I think the experience of the privatised railway system ever since the 1990s across the whole of the UK has shown just how appalling it is. I remember in Parliament, John Major got up after the 92 election and said, the railways will go back into the private sector where they belong. And his transport minister, whoever it was at the time, because they used to change every 3 months, I can't possibly remember what's a great pub quiz game, can you name 10 transport ministers? Said that there will be no subsidies, it will be a fully self-funding and financing operation. Utterly absurd at every level. It was ignoring the social role of the railway, the community role of the railway, ignoring the jobs, ignoring the effect on communities, and then gradually, bit by bit by bit by bit, the railway has moved to some extent back into public ownership. Railtrack was a disaster, had to be ended, and Network Rail was established, which is of course publicly owned. And then there was some devolution of transport making decisions, but perhaps not enough. And I developed a policy for GB Rail, which is absolutely very, very similar to what's in here on all the principles behind it. So this document gives us the opportunity of expanding rail usage, expanding the rail network by reopening lines across Scotland, and recognising that where lines have been reopened, the cost-benefit analysis has often been very realistic. There was a debate for years about the effect of reopening from Edinburgh to Carlisle, the Gala Shields line, and eventually the government was persuaded to reopen as far as Gala Shields, but unfortunately most of it is single track. Ridiculous. It should have been dual track from the very beginning. There should have been a proper investment in it, and there should have been a clear decision to reopen all the way to Carlisle, which improves the rigidity of the rail network as a whole. And there's an awful lot of other lines that could be reopened. Many you would say are far too expensive, but look at the tourist potential, for example. Space and so on. This vision, that vision is about the brilliance of the rail workers being represented on the board, being represented in the brilliance of those people that constructed affordable for everybody. There has to be a transport system with ticketing available on bus, rail, etc. And there has to be a recognition that a railway is more than just a form of transport. It's essential to a community. And years are all over the town, state. That's why this discussion today, sensible transport system, and the base of that has to be railways. You cannot build motorways forever because they simply clog up with more and more cars, and it gets worse and worse and worse. Railways were the right way forward in the 18th and 19th century, and they're 19th century rather, and absolutely the right way forward in the 21st century. Let's catch up with the rest of the world and build the railways the best we can all across Scotland, and let those that know the most about it, those who work on the railways, be the ones who lead it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, and I think that all of what you've said there is really valuable debate that we're having today. And I'd just like to thank our sport unions here in Scotland. I had the honour of joining them when they launched their document for Scotland's railways at the Scottish Parliament a few weeks ago. It was a fantastic launch, but the work that they've done working with each other, standing together, setting out that vision and making sure that their members' voices are heard in terms of the sort of transport services that the people of Scotland want and need is a really, really important role. But more than that, I would like to thank them and pay tribute to the work that they've done in standing together and balloting for industrial action, and in some cases, taking industrial action in terms of their pay and conditions, because that is a very important part of realising a just transition to net zero as well. It's not just about getting the right services and investment in those services that we need. It's also about standing up and fighting for high quality unionised jobs that attract decent paying conditions so that people have a good quality of life. All of these things are important in the just transition, and it's important that workers' voices are leading the way and are at the centre of that. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce my colleagues today, and I'm going to start off by introducing Kevin Lindsay, who's the Scottish Secretary of ASLEF, to give us his contribution and tell us more about the plan for Scotland's railways.
Thanks, Ros. Good morning. A lot of the stuff I was going to say has already been covered by Jeremy, and I'm quite glad I'm to go first out the four unions, because I've got a funny feeling our message will all be similar. But no climate justice without social justice is a nice slogan, but what does it actually mean? Well, I'm going to try to do my short contribution is put that into context within our report and what that actually means. I'm going to talk about the structure, the costs, fares, and industrial strategy for it. Our report is about a fully public-owned railway, not just ScotRail, because everyone talks about the railways in Scotland and it's just ScotRail. It's not. We've got the sleepers. We also have the intercity services, and we have the freight. I often think freight as well is forgotten far too much, which is just wrong. So what we're talking about in our vision is to encapsulate a nationalised railway for the whole of Scotland, for the people of Scotland. We also want the board, the new railway in Scotland, to be made up of local and national politicians. That's something not everyone would necessarily be au fait with, but local politicians who represent their communities must have their say in it. Likewise, passenger groups must be recognised in the board on that, and also trade unions. And I'd also say that rail professionals, we do need the railway management to be involved in the board going forward, because it's crucial that they're involved. But we need political buy-in. We need a political buy-in from across the board, and that means that we are going to take our vision and arguments when we meet the Tory party, when we meet the Lib Dems, and we meet the SNP Labour. We're going to meet with them, we're going to have a debate with them and get buy-in with them, because we want to see the vision become the template. I'm not going to sit here today and say that document there, the 50-odd pages, is the structure for the whole of the railway. For me, it's a starting point, it's a debate. Everyone in this room can contribute, whether you're a passenger, whether you're a worker in the railway, or whether you're a politician. Have your say, get involved in debate, and let's structure the railway how we see it going forward. You look back though, 1967 was a big year in the railway. It wasn't because that was the year I was born, but it was also the year that Beechin done his cuts. And then there was three council areas that stood up and said, we're not having these cuts. That was Merseyside, Gateshead and Newcastle, and Strathclyde. And we've got the benefits of that today here in the Greater Glasgow area, because if the SPT hadn't stood up and demanded that we were running heavy rail trains and the subway in the Glasgow area, we wouldn't have what we've got now. Because people tell us all the time it's too expensive to build the railway. But the vision that the local politicians and officials done back then is a template for us going forward. So for me, that's why it's crucial that local politicians are involved. But it's crucial that passengers have an input, whether that's people representing women, people representing young people, disabled, or just general passengers. Overall, we want all voices to be heard. It's so crucial having a railway for all of Scotland. But if you look at the cost is something that we hear all the time, and I hear the Transport Minister tell me that they've subsidised the railway, they've spent 1.5 billion on the railway. I don't accept that at all. We don't get subsidised in the. There's investment into Scotland's infrastructure. We don't say we subsidise the health service to look after people's health. We don't subsidise schools to give people an education. We invest in the railway, and we have to get the terminology correct going forward. So investing in the railway is an investment in all of our lives, because it gives us an infrastructure to use. But if we're going to have a railway, it's got to be an affordable railway. At this moment in time, we have peak fares. A peak fare. Well, they keep telling us nobody's travelling in peak hours, so why have they not abolished peak fares? I can't understand why, as a society, we've allowed the railway companies and our governments to come up with a thing called peak fares. To me, that's a tax on workers, because it's workers that are going to and from work in the peak times. It's a tax on workers. But likewise, I would suggest that we extend the concessionary travel on buses to the rail. That means that every person over the age of 60 will have free rail travel. Have the capacity people to using the railways. The railway has to be the mode of choice. So we would suggest as well that under 24s get free travel on the railway. And my argument on that is based on two things. The minimum wage, or the despicable minimum wage, and the different levels that we have for young people, they lose the first hour and last hour when they're going to work, because that's what the rail fare is. And if you're a young kid commuting from Paisley into Glasgow, your fare is going to cost you 2 hours of your work. So an 8-hour day, you're only getting 6 hours, and you get 6 hours at a despicable rate based on your wage. That's not acceptable, and it has to change. And we know we've got the capacity, and we've got to get there. But we've also got to look at the people that are using the trains. There's got to be people, and I'd argue, for at least 2 safety critical people on every train, a driver and a guard. Not just a ticket examiner, a guard. Somebody can look after the passengers if something goes wrong. And also having a second person mandated on every train tackles antisocial behaviour. We saw a spike in antisocial behaviour when during the pandemic, when the railway kept running, but we shut down everything else in society, and a lot of our young people had nowhere to go, so they jumped on trains, free Wi-Fi, a heat, and somewhere to do. It became an attractive option for a big gang hut. But railway isn't a gang hut. But we've got to let the young people understand that antisocial behaviour is not acceptable, but at the same time give them the necessary ticketing to use our trains in a responsible manner. So I would argue that we can do that and we should do that. For me, the big issue though, we have to tackle the stock companies. You might not be overly railway minded. The rolling stock companies are the biggest villains in the railway. You might think that Virgin, who walked away with £1 billion in profit for their shareholders in the 16 years they had the West Coast franchise. The rolling stock companies are the biggest criminals in society today for robbing the railway. They're going about fare dodging. This shower, didn't get me started, I'll go off, man. However, try to keep on script, which is never like for me. Just want to point out, a rolling stock company can lease us the trains. The 385 deal that we've done in Scotland, we're leasing them for 25 years and then we get to buy them for £1. Well, I would suggest that we introduce a wealth tax. Let's tax the richest in society and introduce green bonds. Green bonds are similar to what they've introduced in France, and we use that money to purchase Scotland's rolling stock. In that way, we eliminate the profit to these privatised companies who are robbing our rail companies or robbing us as taxpayers and robbing the passengers twice because they're taxpayers and fare payers. It's morally wrong, and we need to look at a way at tackling it. And that's why I would suggest that green bonds work. And the dividend of a green bond will be significantly lower than you would do paying a leasing charge. And green bonds are within the remit of the Scottish Government. The Scottish Parliament has that power if they have the political will. And we're going to take that argument to them to make it, to ensure that we do it. If it's good enough to be done in France, it's good enough for us here today. I'm just going to forget that. The reality is what I'm saying here today is that we're starting the debate. This isn't the end of the debate. We're going to take the argument forward for a people's railway, a railway run by the people, for the people. That's why the four unions have came together to launch a vision of Scotland's railways. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant, Kevin. Thank you very much, and thank you all for keeping it fairly short for us. That was helpful. I'm now going to move on to Mick Hogg from the RMT. Mick.
Okay, thanks very much, Rose. First and foremost, I think it's important to thank Neil Findlay, Tommy Kane and Michael for the contribution that they actually gave the four railway unions in terms of our vision for Scotland's railway, because I think it's important that we obviously took on board that invite to actually do something different, because what we were actually faced with from a Scottish perspective, so far as Scotland's railway was concerned, was a disaster in the sense that ScotRail actually commissioned an Ian Docherty, Professor Ian Docherty, based at Stirling University, who came up with a report that has slash and burn written all over it when it comes to Scotland's railway. Now, I was greatly concerned, as was my colleagues were greatly concerned, because it did not have the vision that we were actually anticipating so far as Scotland's railway was concerned. So we decided to actually come together jointly as four unions in order to actually come up with a robust vision for Scotland's railway that actually put the passengers and put Scotland's railway first, but also actually put the most vulnerable people within the society first also. Because the Ian Docherty report, incidentally, the Ian Docherty character, surprise, was an ex-director of Abilio with ScotRail. So it really begs the question, what was his game all along, so far as the Ian Docherty report was concerned. So we have came up with a report that actually puts Scotland's railways first, because doing nothing was not an option for us. Because as far as we were concerned, Scotland's railway is burning. Scotland's railway is burning and no one's listening. Therefore, we had to come up with an alternative, and we came up with some leaflets, you know, like say, and the slogan, you know, say 6 months. 6 months to actually save Scotland's railway, because that's what it means at the end of the day. That's what we're actually faced with at the end of the day. 6 months to actually save Scotland's railway, because we're conscious of the fact that what's happening south of the border under the Railway Recovery Group. We're well aware of what's taking place. Therefore, in order to outmaneuver the equivalent to what's going to happen so far as Scotland's railway is concerned, we actually need to get our act together, put in place what our vision means for Scotland's railway. And I think what we've actually came up with, right, is a vision that actually works for Scotland's railway. Of that there is no doubt, because it addresses the slash and burn approach. It addresses the Docherty report, because if you look at the Docherty report, it actually suggests to run 300 trains less a day. Over 12 months, that's 100,000 trains less a year. So rather than encourage in the midst of COP26, in order to convince and encourage people to actually leave the car at the house, then this Docherty report actually encourages people to keep using the car opposed to actually public transport. And incidentally, it's perhaps worth making the point also that within Scotland's railway, we actually have 359 stations, of which 149 are staffed. Now, if we're seriously about, like say, addressing the concerns of Scotland's railway by supporting the most vulnerable people within the society, that gives the most vulnerable people within society access to Scotland's trains, then we need to actually make sure that our stations are staffed. Stations are staffed, because there's one thing that's absolutely crystal clear within the Scotland's railway, and that is that antisocial behaviour is on the increase. It's on the increase, and it's off hand. Assaults on passengers, assaults on the staff is getting out of control. It's getting out of control. Hence the reason why we actually need our stations to be staffed in order to ensure that disabled people and the most vulnerable people within the society, that it's safe to use Scotland's trains. You know, because we obviously need to ensure that we have a railway that's accessible, clean, affordable, safe railway for all, that has the vision for Scotland's railway. We need to actually do that, because to do otherwise would be doing our people a disservice. And one of the issues that I want to address also is our industrial relations. Our industrial relations within Scotland's railway is an absolute disaster. An absolute disaster. For the last 18 months, we've been trying to actually find a solution to our industrial relations issues within Scotland, and we made no apology for using COP26 in order to apply the maximum leverage in order for common sense to actually take place, and for Abilio ScotRail, Serco Caledonian Sleeper to actually apply common sense when it comes to key essential workers. Key essential workers who have actually took the risk every day. They'll not only took the risk every day, but took the same risk back to their families every day. Not like the bosses sitting in the house getting paid an absolute fortune. So I'm pleased that eventually we came to a solution so far as Abilio ScotRail is concerned. There's still an outstanding issue regarding Serco Caledonian Sleeper is concerned, but we're in the process of actually dealing with that, and I'm hopeful that a resolution to the Serco Caledonian Sleeper dispute will be announced today as a result of a referendum ballot. But this business of Abilio ScotRail and Serco Caledonian Sleeper and Transport Scotland telling us that they're skint. They've actually received £36 million in performance fees over the piece since March 2020. So for them to actually tell us that they're actually skint, and for them to actually tell key workers, essential workers, if you want a pay rise, then you're actually going to have to give up hard-earned terms and conditions. Unacceptable. Unacceptable as far as the rail unions is concerned. And what we've actually got to take to, as far as I'm concerned, as Kevin Lindsay rightly says, is that under the operator of a last resort, from March, April next year, there's an opportunity, there's a chance to actually learn the lesson, because this franchising model disaster is finished. It's actually broken as far as I'm concerned. We have actually spent billions of pounds on the Scotland's railway, the UK's railway since privatisation. We have got French companies, we've got German companies, we've got Italian companies, we've got Japanese companies, all actually making a profit out of Scotland's railways and the UK railways. And those investments, those profits are actually being reinvested back into the Italian infrastructure, the German infrastructure, the French infrastructure, the Japanese infrastructure. You know, like say, to coin a phrase, you know, like say, economics of the madhouse, because that's what we've got. We've got an economical madhouse taking place, you know, and this is acceptable, and this needs to change. And I'm pleased that under the last resort, we don't, the operator of what it looked like, address the outstanding issues. For example, a no compulsory redundancy agreement and protection of the final salary, a pension scheme. These are not unreasonable questions to ask. These are the questions that we're absolutely desperate to ask. And the only way we're actually going to do that is to actually get round the table with Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government in order to actually find a vision for Scotland's railway. Ros, I'll leave it at that, and happy to take any questions when the time comes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mick, and I'm now going to move to Gary Kelly from the TSSA.
Thanks, Ros. I just wanted to start off by saying a few thanks. So first of all, thanks to Unity, to Tommy, to Neil and to Michael for the work over the last few months. They've done a great job in actually sitting down with the unions and coming up with a report. And we've reflected the views of the unions and union members well, and I think we've done a really good job with the report, but also with the support through launching our campaigns. I also want to thank Jeremy for hosting us at this event today. It's very gracious that we're all here. So thank you for that, and thanks to Roy as well for coming along and chairing it. So just to start off, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, declared a code red for humanity. And we're seeing the effects of climate change all over the world, through wildfires in Australia and America. And the pandemic kicked off with wildfires, through droughts and through various different climate catastrophes. We had one in Scotland, which is attributed to climate change, and that's the tragic events at Stonehaven. So climate change is real, and it's here, and we're living with the consequences of it. And we need to change, essentially. The world leaders are gathered down by the Clydeside to discuss this, to have talks about what commitments they might bring forward. But I think if we're all being honest, I think the time to talk, I think we'll lose action at this point. And I think we as the railway unions have had to sit and think hard about our position in this and how we can contribute towards the wider objective of reducing the impact of climate change and meeting the net zero obligations. I would also indicate that it's not just the climate that's in a code red at the moment, it's the railway itself. We're facing some really significant challenges in the railway. Just to give a bit of context, south of the border, we're looking at £2, maybe £3 billion in cuts from the railway budget. At the moment, they're holding a special voluntary severance scheme, which looks at reducing Network Rail, who are essentially responsible for maintaining the infrastructure of our railways and the safety of our railways, looking to reduce staff numbers by between 7,000 and 10,000, which is between a quarter and a third of the entire workforce. So in the middle of a climate catastrophe, when we have higher levels of rainfall, which are damaging and wrecking the infrastructure, the UK government are essentially, their response to it is, let's make cuts. So it doesn't make a great deal of sense, and it puts everyone at risk, and it puts the railway at risk. Not only that, but they have plans to reduce booking offices. They put 230 million aside, it's around 230 million aside, to move to a paperless ticketing system, which would effectively have the end goal or objective is to eliminate booking offices, which again creates a railway which is more unsafe. Booking offices don't just sell tickets, they do vital maintenance work like gritting and salting to make sure that the station is actually safe for people to use and to utilise. They're on hand to make sure that if there's an incident at the station, they can provide support and assistance. They provide support and assistance to passengers as well on a day-to-day basis, and they also assist with the likes of accessibility for any passengers who may require additional support and assistance. So we're facing a real code red here, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? So the four unions have essentially come together to come up with this report, calling for the Scottish Government to have a real look at what the railway actually is. I think my colleague Kevin touched on it. We view the railway as a vital public service. That's the way we look at it. People don't question the amount of money that's been put into hospitals. They don't question the amount of money that's been put into the police, because it is a public service. It's a part of our national infrastructure, and it's something that we need to cherish. But the railway also gives back. There was a recent report undertaken which showed that for every £1 spent on the railway, there's another £2.50 generated into the wider economy. In terms of the environmental benefits of the railway is one of the most environmentally friendly forms of transport. There are very few other forms of transport which produce as little carbon as the railway. I think maybe hydrogen buses. I think was it ScotRail that said one train is the equivalent of taking 500 cars off the road. So by their own metric, and arithmetic's not really my strong point, but by their own metric, if they reduce the services by 100,000 per annum, then that's about 50 odd million cars more potentially on the road. And we're trying at this moment in terms of the climate catastrophe to encourage people to use public transport and to get away from using the car in order to meet and to reduce carbon emissions. And reducing rail services is not the way to do that. And I would also suggest that making or leading the railway to a less safe place through reductions in infrastructure spending, through reduction of staff in Network Rail, through the closure of booking offices and the like, which will lead to an increased antisocial behaviour. People don't think the railway is safe, they simply won't use it. So that's, for people, even if you keep the trains there, if it's an unsafe, or we're providing an unsafe offering, people will elect to use the car. So for convenience, safety, everything points towards adequately funding the railway, but not only adequately funding the railway, but actually growing it and trying to move people away from the vehicles. Glasgow is due to be, we're already, I'm not sure if it's, but Transport Scotland is, I realise, Glasgow is due to move into a low emission zone. Edinburgh has been slated for the train. If we're denying people access to the train, how do they actually get into the city centres? How do people get to and from work? How do we support the nighttime economy? These are all questions which we're putting to the Scottish Government to ask why at this moment in time are we just rail services? What we're putting forward in this report is a vision. What we need is a railway which is clean, green, affordable, reliable and accessible. And the report puts forward the support required to meet that. Let's be honest about what the railway is. As I say, it's a public service, and where it's been in the 60s, which was way before my time, the railways were privatised. They were starved of funding, starved of finances. And the same thing's happening to the NHS, as you probably already know. Let's cut the budget. No, it looks bad. Who's going to ride in and save the NHS? Well, it's the private sector. The same thing happened to the railways years ago. But it didn't work. It never worked. And it never will work, because the private companies, the privateers only care about the bottom line. They don't care about the punters, they don't care about the workers. What they care about is their shareholders. And so we can't make the same mistake with NHS, but we've made the mistake with railways, and the government, the UK government, and the Scottish government, through Michael Matheson, have come out and said, actually, privatisation, well, not privatisation, franchising doesn't work, it never really has. So let's move to a different model. We have a real opportunity here to enact some proper, meaningful changes. The history of the railways of privatisation has always been a form of corporate welfare. In down south, we're moving towards a different system, the passenger service contracts, which removes the franchising model. But they're keeping the privateers in situ, they're keeping them there to run the railway. And I think we should be doing something different up here in Scotland. We have an opportunity because ScotRail is moving into an operator of last resort to retain that as a public service, to retain it as operated by the people for the people. And I think we need to take both hands and really seize that opportunity, banish the privateers and run the railway for us, have worker representation on the board, have diverse groups of people on the board, lots of disability groups, etc. Just to highlight this point, maybe not many people know, but Abellio are actually in a better financial position now than they were pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, they were struggling financially. They went to the Scottish Government and said, we need more money to run this railway. The Scottish Government said, no, you're not providing value for money. COVID was a stroke of luck for them. They've actually, I don't think they're turning a profit, but their losses have been more significantly mitigated. So they've actually walked away from this Abellio with more money in the pocket than they would have otherwise. Let's not let it happen again. Let's take the opportunity, seize it, come up with a system, like Kevin says. Everybody here is a stakeholder. Let's work together. Let's have a discussion today about how we can build a better railway for everyone. Thanks very much.
Brilliant, thank you, Gary. And I think the back cover of the report is even more important. It's a people's ScotRail that we want, and now is our opportunity to build that. So I will move on now to our final speaker of the top table, Pat Mcllvogue from Unite.
Thanks very much, Ros. And what's left for me to say? Maybe that's a bit one of the downsides of your union starting with the letter U and you go thanks very much, Ros, and thanks as well for the support the SDUC have gave in regards to the rail unions. And I think it is really encouraging that the 4 trade unions have came together. Yes, we came together in a coordinated dispute around paying conditions where the privateer Abellio was ignoring us for nearly 18 months, but they were quite happy, as Gary's alluded to have their losses covered and their end covered. And let's be quite frank about it, Abellio and the privateering model is flawed. It is flawed. And if we allow them, they would take the cement from the bricks of the depots and take it with them and everything else that they could lay their hands on. All they're concerned about is the profit, they're not concerned about the service, they're not concerned about the people, and they're not concerned about the country. And I think what we've got is an opportunity now. We've got an opportunity now. I'd also like to lay thanks to Unit Consultancy for helping us putting this document together. And it is a starter for 10, and it is to stimulate debate, contribution, so that collectively we can have a vision going forward. And I'd like to thank Germany as well, not just for hosting this, but for those of you that don't know, it's not just flavour of the month and it's rail and it's co-op and it's environmental. Germany, when he was leader of the Labour Party, supported our members at the Calais Springburn, and ultimately, the unsuccessful campaign to stop another privateer in Mutares, the German venture capitalist, stripping Scotland's railway of its infrastructure. And Germany, along with Paul Sweeney, MP at the time, was very supportive, and I'd like to lay personal thanks to yourself, Germany, for that. Thank you. And that leads us on. We spoke about the service, we spoke about the passengers, but who keeps the railway going, who keeps the railways going, and who maintains it, who repairs it, who overhauls it, is effectively the engineers and the Unite members. And what I want to lay thanks to is the contribution that our members have made in that industrial anti-trade union technique and tactic of lockout, where we get the fingers pointed at the trade unions for having to take industrial action and go on strike. Here was an employer who was actually locking our members out of the engineering depots. Coming to the rail and negotiated was on harassment, anti-trade union tactics, and that tactic without the actions and the resolute actions of Unite members, I don't think we'd have got a resolution that we got, and I need to lay thanks to them. And I know it's all about looking back, but we need to give credit and we need to learn from that and going forwards. And we should never have a situation where Scottish workers are forced to be locked out of their workplace because a privateering employer who cares nothing for the service, cares nothing for the people that work on it. The whole infrastructure of Scotland Ways is in tatters. It is the only way to describe it. We've had the industrial vandalism of the closing of railway depots that support the infrastructure of Scotland's railway. Kevin spoke about Roscoe's and the carriages, how they are siphoning finances from the railways in Scotland. What we've got is that these carriages have been years to heavy maintenance depots that have Wagtech and Kilmarnock closed. The Cali Springburn, 2 miles down the road, closed, all within the last 2 years. Scotland cannot support its own railway. We said to Michael Matheson, the Transport Secretary, how can you run a country? How can you have Scotland's railway if you can't repair, fix, overhaul and maintain those carriages in Scotland? We've got the environmental vandalism now, because what we had was the industrial vandalism of shutting those depots, and now the absurd situation what we've got is carriages get put in the back of a diesel flatbed lorry and they get transferred to Wales and to England to be repaired and overhauled. So how can that be economic? How can that be environmentally friendly when we can't support our own railways? And that's why this document's saying that we've got an opportunity now. We had a small element of success in the wage negotiations where some HST work was coming back in house, getting out back in house to ScotRail. What we are looking for is all the overhaul, repair and maintenance work to be back in-house, for the depots to be brought back in-house as well, to be nationalised effectively. Because how can you support the trains of Scotland if you don't have an infrastructure? It is in absolute tatters. Michael Matheson, the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, made a commitment to that site at Springburn that it would become a rail hub. Unite put forward a proposal 2 years ago about diversification of line, because the line's just off of Glasgow and Edinburgh, electric line. It would cost between £1 million and £4 million to electrify that line. Use that depot, diversify it into light, medium and heavy repair. Look for diversification into repair of the rolling stock with seats, whatever's required. Use that facility. Use that facility. All we got for the Scottish Government at the time was it's a commercial decision by a private employer. We can't intervene rules. We're out of Europe. Now we get it's subsidy control. Well, what we're saying is it's not a commercial decision, it's a service. We should be utilising these depots, we should be developing these depots, should begin point about where the progress on rail went from steam to diesel to electrification. What the Scottish Government done was they brought in HSDs, high-speed trains, 40-year-old, heavy diesel, and they were not only polluting the atmosphere, but they were dumping human waste on the track. How's that a step forward? And the irony in this whole situation is they've left our engineers to fix these relics. You can't get the parts, you can't fix them. Where was forward? And that's where this document is calling for that infrastructure to be brought back in-house, but that needs to be linked to an overarching industrial strategy with the Scottish Government working with trade unions, because too many times it's happened that commercial decisions in boardrooms out with the UK look at ailing Scottish factories, ailing Scottish depots that have been neglected, that have not had investment put in them, and then they make a spreadsheet economics decision to say it's going to cost so much for that, to keep the water out, to update it, etc. Close it and move the work to England, close it, move the work elsewhere. And that's where we're saying we need the infrastructure within Scotland, we need the infrastructure to be put back in-house, because the one positive thing that we've got in Scotland is we've got the skills, we've got the knowledge, and we've got the experience. And all the men and women that worked in the rail depots at Kilmarnock and at Calais stand ready to return to serve Scotland's railways. And that's where we are calling for the Scottish Government to engage with trade unions progressively and look about the infrastructure of Scotland's railways and look how we can maintain that going forward. And I'm going to close on that, Rose. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to thank all the panellists. I'm sure you agree with me that there's a whole wide range of points being raised there. We've had points about the need to overhaul and completely shift our industrial relations map for the railways in Scotland. We've had points about the way that the current private model has failed to not only service users but the workforce and the delivery of the railway services. We've had a lot of points about how important this is to the whole agenda being discussed down the road in the COP around, code red for humanity, the absolute need for us to shift to a net zero way of operating and how essential rail services are to that whole system going forward. And we've also, had a thought about, the importance of having a rail service to social justice, to people, and, what a great contribution that a well-resourced rail service can make to the people of Scotland. And I think that an opportunity of the Scottish Government, and very soon actually, I think it's next April, taking over the rail franchise, and the absolute need for us to build and really mobilise people to demand that stays as a public service and that we take control of our rail system going forward. So I've been told I'm not allowed to take questions from the floor, but what I thought I could do with the time left is just ask each of the panellists maybe some questions. The reason being we've got Zoom here, it's getting live streamed out and we need to have microphones and we don't have a roving mic, I'm afraid. So my apologies for not being able to take questions from the floor, but I'm going to come back to each of the panellists with a question and just get your thoughts, and then I'm going to hand over to Jeremy to give the final words before we close up. So I'm going to start, I think, with Gary. And Gary, you talked a lot about the environmental impact of the railways and really linked us into the COP and what's going on down the road. But just more widely, what's your impression of what the COP's delivered so far or is capable of delivering, and do you think it will help the rail unions to take this agenda forward?
Tricky question. It's difficult because I've not been in the room, but I think first and foremost it is important for the event to happen. ASCO is that I did read that the majority of delegates at ASCO were from Foster, the largest group in the room, because we know what their agenda will be. Their agenda will be move along, nothing to see here. So that's a real worry. But I do think it's important that the discussions are taking place. I think we had a brief chat. I think it's as much as what's happening in there, and the decision makers will go in and eat their foie gras and canapes and what have you. I think it's incumbent on us who are not at the table, and that's the unions and wider society as a whole, to make our voices heard about what we want to see change. So that's where we come in to put the pressure back onto our decision makers to make sure that if they make commitments at COP, that they uphold them, and also that they take into account our voices about various different areas where we are operating, whether it is the railway industry, whether it's aviation, that we are putting forward a view, and that we're putting pressure on decision makers within the Scottish Government and beyond. Am I optimistic? I think Boris was supposed to be jetting back up because the 1.5 was not really achievable based on the targets that were agreed to at the actual meeting, but world above, I don't think Boris is going to be able to do anything with that. I think I'd say slightly optimistic, but we all know this. We all know the script here. Quite a lot of the politicians have vested interests. There's one just recently that's lost a job because of it. Do we trust the current UK government to make decisions that are in the best interests of us, the people? I would say probably not. And what we need to do is to mobilise, make our voice heard, and to basically hold their feet to the fire on the issues that matter to us.
Thanks. And I'm going to come to Kevin next and just ask Kevin, maybe if you could expand, Kevin. You were saying very clearly that you feel that the private model has really failed us. Do you want to say a bit more about that, about some of the areas there? I know you were holding yourself back. This is your chance to give us a bit more detail about some of the excesses and some of the profit suckers that are taking that investment out of our railways.
I think you've probably summed up perfectly, profit suckers. I can't understand for the life of me why anyone thinks that we have to run services at a profit. Surely the railway is for the people. It should be for the worker. If there's only 4 folk on the late shift getting the train out of Balloch into the centre of Glasgow, it's there, it's a service. Why does it have to be run at a profit? Profit, I'm not against railways being viable, cost neutral, but it sticks in my throat that we're allowing people who have, take Serco for an example. Serco run the Caledonian sleepers. I'd love to be in the room when somebody came up, let's give it to Serco. They have no railway experience. They have no railway staff. They have no railway coaches. They have no railway engines. They have no railway drivers. Yeah, let's give it to Serco, because they used to transport prisoners around. That seems a great idea. Absolute madness. Absolute madness. Why you would give a contract like that. And then we look at ScotRail. ScotRail was under National Express. They handed back the keys because they couldn't afford the bid. But then had First Group come in. First Group did a reasonable job. Really started the downfall of poor industrial relations. It was very much adversarial attitude. But they did a reasonable job. The trains were getting there. And then we had the all singing, promise you the whole world Abellio. I've got to say, when Abellio got the franchise, I thought things were looking up. But I need to watch my language because we've all been on a promise, right? But I've got to say, Abellio, geez, come on. Like, they promised the world and delivered nothing. Delivered nothing. Right? And it sticks in my throat again that Abellio have been given a management fee throughout the pandemic. Why are we giving them a management fee for running the railway? What we should have done is said, by the way, we're not giving you an extra penny. And if you didn't want to run the railway on these terms, get out. Get out. Because you're out in 6 months' time, you should have been out then. It's beyond comprehension that we've allowed the privatisers to suck another £36 million of Scottish taxpayers' money I would have invested that in a multitude of different things, and we could have come up with a multitude of great ideas to do it. So privatisation is a failed model. The railway should be for the people and run by the people. That to me seems a straightforward way of looking at it. And I've never understood why we have to privatise. Privatisation is good, public services is bad. Nonsense. Reverse it the other way. Run the railway for the people, for all the people. Whether you're disabled, whether you're a lone traveller, whether you're a young person. Let's get people on trains. Let's have an integrated transport system. Let's get our buses back into public ownership. Right? Let's have an integrated ticketing system. Again, COP26. We've managed to deliver an integrated ticketing system for COP26 delegates only. But we can't do it for the people of Scotland. What are we all about? What are we all about as a nation? We need to stand up and be counted. And to me, it's straightforward. An integrated transport system involves an integrated ticketing system for the people, not for the privatisers.
I'm going to turn to Mick now and just ask Mick, and I will give a plug for the Serco picket line tomorrow night, don't worry, before things are over, and also for the strike fund, so please listen out for when I cover that. But I'm just going to ask you, Mick, you're obviously really frustrated about the direction that industrial relations have turned, and I think rightly outraged at the way unions have been vilified for using what leverage, that was available to them. But I'd like to ask you just to focus on, come next year, what do you think could be done to really improve if we went forward with a public sector model? What could be done to involve workers' voices in developing that vision? And how could we turn around industrial relations? I think
having the good industrial relations goes a long way, Ros. Because this disaster we've actually experienced speaks volumes in terms of what we've tried to achieve over the last 18 months. We've been trying to get to the table for the last 18 months, and we've been stonewalled for the last 18 months. We were told that the only show in town was efficiency savings. Like say, if you want a pay increase, then you actually have to give up hard-earned terms and conditions. Now, that was unacceptable as far as the RNT and the other unions were concerned, because as far as we were concerned, key essential workers should have been given medals. Should have been given medals what we actually delivered throughout the pandemic. And our industrial relations greatly suffered of that. There is no doubt, because industrial relations were seen as a disaster. Like say, a Billy ScotRail were seen as a Serco Caledonian were seen as a disaster. We couldn't talk to any employer about, like say, finding a solution so far as the current disputes was concerned. And if you take the rest of the working dispute, a prime example, we were actually in dispute for 8 months, and we couldn't get near the table. But all of a sudden, like say, COP26, and there was this desperate need in order to actually get round the table, in order to actually find a solution. And what we were actually seeking, so far as the rest of the working dispute was concerned, was fairness, equality, justice, climate justice for key essential workers. We got stonewalled. And what a Billy ScotRail, Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government tried to achieve over the peace was to try to bully us into submission. And I'm pleased to say that they failed. They failed because we ended up delivering deals for our members that were actually fair deals and equal deals for all workers within Scotland's railway. So as far as I'm concerned, like say, perseverance and direct action worked at the end of the day, because we've ended up delivering a deal for our members that actually works for our members. And let's be clear, like see, we will be ready for the battle, the fight that's going to come our way come March, April next year, because we're well aware of what's taking place south of the border under the real recovery group, and whatever the equivalent is going to look like up here in Scotland, we will be ready. We will be ready, because that is one of the reasons why we've actually took the initiative in order to put ScotRail, whatever that looks like, Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government behind the 8 ball so far as Scotland's railways are concerned, because we're well aware that what Scotland's railway needs is more investment, more jobs, and more support at the end of the day. And let's not forget what took place previously. You know, like say under the driver only operation. You know, and if you take Scotland's railway, 57% of Scotland's railway is driver only, and the remaining 43% is the conventional way trains, a guard on the train. And the difference being is if a guard does not turn up for the train is cancelled on the grounds of safety. But if the second person doesn't turn up for the train, the train still runs under driver only. And back in 2016, we stopped that further extension of a driver only by taking direct industrial action in order to actually fight that position. And what we actually had back in 2016, we actually had public support on our side. And why did we actually have public support on our side? Because this strike was all about safety. That's what the strike was all about in 2016. We took strike action and we stopped an extension of the driver only operation. So what we actually need going forward, Ros, right, is a good industrial relation that puts Scotland's railways first. And I'm absolutely convinced with the right approach, the right attitude, we'll actually get this right. But I don't think it's going to come without fighting, without battling for the common sense to actually reveal. And if that means engaging with the politicians, then so be it. Because what's took place over the peace, where it be Transport Scotland, where it be the Scottish Government, where it be ScotRail, where it be Circle Caledonia Sleeper, they've used the pandemic. They've used the pandemic in order to slash and burn Scotland's railway. And I'll leave it at that, Rose.
Thank you. I've just been told by the powers that be that I actually can take questions as long as I recite them into the microphone to make sure the live stream can hear. But I'm just going to ask Pat, before I do that, just ask Pat if he will reflect on, you know, what is the green contribution and the contribution towards net zero that a well-resourced, publicly run railway in Scotland could deliver?
Well, I think the first thing would be that we look to remove the HSTs that are 40 years old that are chugging up and down in Scotland that we're going to struggle to fix in years to come. And we look, I think it's about 40% of the journeys are electrified. I think we need to look at the electrification across the board. I think we then need to, in my opening contributions, was how do you support that and what's the infrastructure looks like? Because as I said in my earlier contribution, we've had the industrial vandalism of closing the depots and the infrastructure. We've now got the environmental vandalism where we're starting carriages on flatbed lorries and driving them to England and Wales for overhaul and repair. It's absurd. That's the only way to describe it. That's where when we refer to the Cali Rail Works and an opportunity, because let's make reference to it with the privateers that don't let a crisis get in the way of an opportunity. Then why do we not look to the same view? We're in a crisis, but here's the opportunity. Here's the opportunity to look to have a railway that's self-sustaining and it can support itself, because it's independence and how they want Scotland to be a self-sustaining nation. And be able to support itself and run itself. How can you do that if you can't even run your own railway? So I think you use the railways to demonstrate that it can be done in Scotland, it can be environmentally friendly, and look for diversification that their proposal with the infrastructure was around. Look at electrifying the depots, look at diversification into light, medium and heavy maintenance, but also the auxiliary services as well. And if we had that transport hub where we could look at the infrastructure of the depots themselves, look at where we get the forms of energy into it, where we look for solar, or, and I was going to go on my hobby horse about wind turbines and how we were strapping wind turbines for Indonesia and China and sticking them on diesel vessels all the way across Scotland when we could be using the BIFAB yard in the East Coast or CS Wind in Campbelltown. It's absolutely mind-boggling. And my other contribution earlier was around state aid or subsidy control. Well, for me, the Scottish Government's not got that out anymore. And other countries, how else, when we're talking about environmentally friendly, we're talking about climate control, surely the objective justification would be, we talk about Scotland, and if we look, it was the, Alex Salmon said that the Saudi Arabia, the North renewables. There's not one place in Scotland makes a wind turbine. We shut it. It was closed. CS Wind in Campbelltown. And then we look at the BIFAB yards in the East Coast who are actually looking out onto the wind farm. But we've not got any of the work. And then a wee bit of the work is absolutely piecemeal. So they talk about the environment, they talk about, but I still can't get my head on it, around how it's better to put them on a diesel vessel around the world and back again, by the way, whereas it could be done in Scotland. These fables are finished for the Scottish Government. If they're real and they're a mile down the road parading themselves that they're at the forefront of climate control, I'm sorry, it doesn't stack up to the objective justification, because we can't build a wind farm. And if we could, then we should then look to bring them in those technologies, whether it be solar, whether it be tide, whether it be wind, and use them to heat and power our depots and our factories. And it needs to be that joined up industrial strategy, Roz. It needs to be joined up. So I think the only way they do that is sitting down, and I think as well that needs to come from the Scottish Government and cross-party, that we sit down and we look at an overarching industrial strategy that's not just got a thread. It's not got a thread environmentalism in it. It's got a big rope that's tying it to it, and it can rely on it. And we need to hold people to account, and they can't look for outs anymore with state aid or subsidy control. Thanks very much.
Tonight, I actually look forward to talking to Pat more tonight about some of these wider issues, because it's absolutely right, local supply chains and how we build them, how we invest, all these things are vitally important to the wider just transition and the journey to net zero, and railways have definitely got a key role to play in that. I'm going to open it up now that I know I'm allowed to take questions from the floor, so if anybody has what I think there's someone here's got a question. I'll maybe take 3 questions and then I'll ask the panel to very quickly respond, and apologies for not coming to you sooner. So I will repeat each of the questions, so over to you and then I'll repeat them.
I'm a self-confessed tree hugger, and I would like to ask the panel, everybody, what do you feel about HS2?
Okay, so that question was around HS2 and the development of HS2 and its impact on the environment. So we'll keep that on hold. You know that's one to respond to. I can see a gentleman up the back here and then another gentleman here, and then I'm going to go back to the panel for one final type.
Alan Ware, Secretary, ASLEF Branch Secretary, also Vice Chair at SPT, and a councillor. my ask is my question is more an ask, because we talked about the issue of the timetable change and the documentary report take place. My question is more an ask insofar as that particular period of time will be shortly on top of us. And I thought what Pat mentioned and the way he outlined the whole kind of scenario of the outs that the Scottish Government has in a number of things that we've used over the years. They days are finished, and we need to try and nail them on the issue of transport. I think it's a disgrace that we do not have a cabinet minister on transport. That should be an absolute priority given how big transport is. And I like the language that the top table's using in relation to talking about investment rather than costing, because transport is an investment in terms of the wider society. But what we don't make this point about the docket report, and it's been touched on, that is the Scottish version of the Williams Commission. Let's be under an illusion. That is the Scottish version of the Williams report. And that commission, that report that was initiated, I do not believe that was initiated by ScotRail to basically look at ScotRail's transport in terms of rail. That was definitely a shield that was commissioned by the Scottish Government to basically...
Alan, can I ask you, is there a question in there or is it?
My ask is this, that councils that serve communities, real communities in public transport and rest, and I ask that basically we get the motions into local government, and also I know Steve Bigman and colleagues here, to make sure that these motions are carried out and our local authorities across Scotland. I think
So,
it's very important.
That's a key point being made by the comrade there about the role that local authorities can play in supporting this, and I certainly think that's something that we can do, is go and seek support from our local authorities across Scotland, not just for trains and a publicly owned, well-resourced train transport system, but also around our buses and taking our buses back into public control and public ownership, and following the example of Lothian buses, where, you know, services and passenger numbers have grown because it's a people-controlled public service. So there's a lot the comrade up the back there.
Thanks a lot very much, Jeremy. And I live in benefits and possibly travel around this city. £5.35 the other day, Mike, when we met to go to government. When I got word the GMB workers on, I couldn't afford to go back into George Square for an hour. Now I know a friend that had to walks to job centres when he's unemployed from the cost of Western Bartonshire to goes by here to sign on. Now, when you're private, you don't have any money. Weekends, you don't have any money to do that. Do you think the document's going far enough, actually not including that everybody on benefits should be getting free transport? And how do we integrate the campaigns we've got in Glasgow for the integrated more transport model? Buses are a luxury for them in Glasgow. And just quickly, Jen, and I said this to some people when we were celebrating Wee Greta coming up. How many of the young activists in Glasgow who back Greta Thunberg have never been on that train journey because of the cost? So I think it's important to wait out. And Jim, just a cheeky question, what would you have said at the COP this week? Because many's campaigned around Glasgow this time 2 years ago saying to the green activists in this city, you would be a better person than Boris here today. So thanks a lot, comrades. I'm sorry for the cheeky one at the end.
I'm sure we'll get Jeremy to answer that at the very end when he comes in. I'm going to stop now because we really are about to run out of time. But just to say, the comrade there was asking about, you know, free travel and accessibility, and I think that is a really big issue. Up to 30% of Scottish homes don't have a car. So we are talking about, you know, the price of transport, the accessibility. That's why transport is such a crucial and essential public service for people. So I'm going to briefly ask each of the panel members if you can keep this to less than a minute, folks, and then I'm going to go back to Jeremy to sum up at the end. So I'll start at this end, Gary.
Just to start the first question on high-speed trains, our union's position is in support of HST. I think that one of the issues is trying to get people away from cars. It's a difficult question. We had this one conference and we debated it at length. The old question of, do you kill one person to save 1,000 comes into play. You know, there's a wee bit of the environment that you might impact and destroy, but is the wider benefit, does it offset that? So it's a difficult one. I do appreciate that, but I think the important thing is the analysis and the weight of it, and we can bring the side of support. In terms of local councils, it's still an idea knocking about, but the 4 trade unions here are going to get together. So it was yourself that asked it. 4 trade unions are going to get together. We're continuing to work together. And one of the ideas that's been knocking about is a letter that we can send it to members, supporters, to say, write to your MP, write to your MSP, write to your local councillors. Here's the report. Give it your backing and tell them, you know, we back the railways. We want you to back. We'll get looking at getting motions at the Parliament, etc., all that sort of stuff. In terms of benefits, we do touch upon benefits in the report. It's mentioned. I wholeheartedly agree. Look, I've been in the same position, you know, where I've got 2 pennies to rub together, go to the fridge and wondering what you're going to eat that day. I've been there, done it. They've offered, one of the things we're looking at is they've offered free transport for younger people on the buses. There's already free transport for elderly people, but there's not really an equivalent provision in rail. There's wee bits and bobs there. I think that we need to push the Scottish Government on those points, but I would be wholeheartedly in support of providing an offering for anybody who's in benefits. And just the final point, with the offering that's on the table with the buses versus rail, I think what we're kind of seeing gradually is a 2-tier transport system. It might already even be here. Only people that can afford to use rail are going to be able to use rail. See, the people who can't afford to use rail, they'll be on the bus, either because it's here or because it's cheaper. And I don't want to see that. I think the railway should lecture a wider society, and anybody that wants to use it should have access to it.
Thank you very much. Kevin?
HS2, support it if it comes all the way to Scotland and to Edinburgh and Glasgow. That way will eliminate short-haul flights. It's just, to me, it's straightforward, and you never have to apologise for being a tree hugger. I'm a long-standing Green of the Hibernian persuasion. That's a separate debate. As for meeting city councils, happy to go to meet the Eastern Bartonshire, Glasgow, wherever, and we'll continue our campaign to take it forward. And thirdly, we do touch on transport poverty. Have we went far enough? Well, we could always go further. So we fully support what you're saying there, colleague, and we would look to do that going forward. But again, this is a starting point, not the end.
Thank you, okay, I'm going to go to Mick. Member time, Mick.
HS2, we certainly support if it means permanent guaranteed jobs, and as Kevin rightly says, if it comes to Scotland, and like Kevin, like say anything that's green, I'm your man, because I'm a good Hib supporter.
The existing one that's to Birmingham.
The timetable we change is an absolute disaster, as we've already alluded to. The Docherty report is an absolute disaster. So what we've actually done, to use an old mind in saying, the past we inherit, the future we build. Our vision is this momentum in terms of Scotland's vision, in terms of Scotland's railway. And just to finally finish, make the point about, like, say, free to travel for 24-year-olds and 6-year-olds. It's a start, it's a step in the right direction. I'll leave it at that, Rose.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you.
Left me to last again, Roy.
That's right, coming out.
It's because I know you can handle it, comrade.
I think in HS2, in regards to United's point of view, that there's a whole range of jobs there, and we're supportive of that, because you've got construction jobs as well in it. I think it does need to take into consideration communities and where it is, and if they can be rerouted and there's less disruption. I think that needs to be taken into consideration, and there needs to be due consultation on that. I think in regards to timetable changes, I think it's a paradox. How do you get people, more people back on the trains? You put on less of them. I don't think that works. So I think there does need to be a campaign within local communities to say, well, for our community, it's going to be of a huge detriment because we're not going to have a train, or rather, it's going to be a service 1 an hour rather than 3 an hour. So I think that those representations need to be made through elected representatives. I think on the benefits question, I think that a rail service needs to be reliable, affordable and accessible. I think there's a broader discussion to be had. I don't think anybody wants to be on benefits, but for just at the universal cut on benefits at £20, that's made it less accessible. So I think there's a broader discussion about if anybody's unfortunate enough that they need the state to support them, that level of benefit should be of a level that allows you to get a bus, to get a train. Because the other argument to that is, how can you go and get a job if you can't travel? What is it, Norman Tevitt and go on your bike? No, it needs to be accessible. And on the point around being green, I think the whole, and I'm going to steal, I don't know if it was Jackson or if it was Roz that used the line, but I thought it was very apt, that for trade unions to become more green, we need environmentalists to be more red, and that's where we're asking you to support your trade unions. And that's
Okay, so I'm going to give the last words to Jeremy, and then I'll just make a few closing remarks.
Very briefly, first of all, thank you everyone for coming, and huge thank you to Unity Consulting for putting this report together. Neil, Tommy and Michael have done a fantastic job here, and I think they've shown just the importance of their work as a way of being as a resource for the Labour movement and progressive campaigns all over Scotland. So thank you very much to them. I think we should. On your point on HS2, there has to be an increase in rail capacity from the north to the south of the UK, because at the moment, London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Newcastle are working at absolutely maximum capacity. You cannot get more trains on it. The train paths are simply not available. And if we want to increase the use of railways, which we do, then you have to free up space for freight, and you have to speed up freight, because at the moment, the railways in the UK are dominated by the speed of passenger trains, and therefore train paths for freight are more difficult to get because they're slower and take longer. In the USA, it's the other way around, which is why passenger trains in the USA are so slow and so unreliable. So there's got to be a change there. Secondly, on HS2, I think it should have started in Birmingham and moved northwards rather than starting in London and gone to Birmingham as an indication of UK-wide investment. But I also think the route planning has been poor, and it does make the point that there has to be a legal environmental entitlement in all planning decisions, so that there is somebody in all planning considerations that's speaking up for natural world, for historic and ancient woodlands and so on in the route planning that goes with it. But I have to also say, the land taken up by railways compared to roads is utterly minimal. If you come from Edinburgh to Glasgow for a short period, the train line goes alongside the motorway. Look at the land taken up by the railway, the number of people on the railway compared to the number on the road, using about 5 times as much land area. So for environmental considerations, railways are the right way forward. And this document indicates all of that. This has got to be the jumping off point for a campaign for full public ownership and expansion of the rail system and the public transport network all across Scotland. This document is a fantastic tool for campaigning. It's a fantastic tool to create local community meetings, discussing how you can improve your public transport and rail system. It's also about looking after railway staff and ensuring there is a person on every train to deal with passenger safety. Just look at the numbers of the staff employed. There are more drivers than there are train staff. Well, that tells you the whole story. Absolutely, the whole story is there. Must be somebody on every train from the point of view of safety. Otherwise, you're not going to get people on it. And on the question of rail franchises and the role of the Scottish Government, April next year is a turning point in all of this. It's a turning point that we can use. We can use as a campaign to bring our railways completely back into public, as we said, about the infrastructure. How stupid and short-sighted it was to close down Springburn. How ridiculous, as you say, to stick a 1970 designed HS2 train on the back of a truck and take it to Doncaster or wherever to be refurbed and then brought back on a truck. It was a great train in 1970. It was a fantastic train. It was a huge development, but it's well past its sell-by date. It's very heavy. It uses lots of diesel fuel. It is a polluting train. We've got to move on. You need lighter, faster, cleaner trains, preferably electric. And if I just say so, whilst I absolutely support electrification of lines, it is perfectly possible to have short stages of electrification with a battery backup on the train, so that the batteries are charged during the period there's an overhead wire, and therefore you don't need to have overhead wires on the whole length of the line, because they're actually very expensive to install, and they're also very vulnerable to storms and bad conditions. Let's invest in that technology. But if we run a railway system where the likes of Abellio, the likes of all the others that are trying to take money out of the rail system, look at the figures in there of the dividends that have been paid out of railways ever since privatisation. Every one of those dividends that's been paid out is money that could have gone into investment in our public transport system, decent pay for our staff, and real security of public transport for all of our communities. Get the leeches off the railway, get the staff into the trains, and get the public back onto the trains. We'll have a clean, green, efficient, and safe transport system. That's what this document gives you the chance to achieve. Let's do it.
Very much, Jeremy. I just want to finish with a couple of very short remarks. Firstly, to remind all the people here that tomorrow night, I think it's 9:30 p.m, there will be a picket line at Glasgow Central Station for the ongoing Serco Caledonian Sleeper dispute. There is hope of a resolution, but as things stand at this point in time, that picket line will be there, and we would appreciate all people who can come and give that picket line support. Also would appreciate donations to the RMT's Regional Council. Cheques can be sent to 180 Hope Street, Glasgow G2 2UE, or bank transfers to 337-20412, and the sort code is 608301. Now, I just want to say that I hope this has given you a really good insight into how the future of our railways in Scotland can play a key part in a just transition to net zero. And it is exactly issues like this, issues around progressive taxation, issues around fair work and public ownership of our key areas that we need to be talking about, and we need to grow the conversation and build alliances. The most hopeful thing I've seen all week was the young people who marched on Friday in the Fridays for Future movement, because their banner said system change, not climate change. And I'll leave you with a wee quote as well. The quote I'll leave you with is from Chico Mendes, a great trade unionist and environmentalist, who said, "Environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening." Thank you very much.